Hello everybody, and welcome to Journey of an Artist, which is sort of a visual podcast that documents my journey into art. While I paint a scene for you to watch, I discuss my theories about life. Each episode, I dive into philosophies that I feel like need to be discussed. This is not a tutorial video, so if that's what you're here looking for, I'm sorry to disappoint. This is something entirely different, but I encourage you to stick around because you just might learn something not about painting. So, my theory behind tutorials is that it's not always the best idea to just hop on the internet and figure out how to do something that way. Like, yeah, sometimes it can come in handy, but if all you're ever doing is being told how to do this or how to do that, you're not going to really develop your own style. And not only that, but you're not going to struggle. And struggle is a very important part of life. Even though it can be a little bit rough and frustrating, it's very important that we struggle in life. And that's a big theme in this episode, is struggle, because today we are painting a winter scene, and I'm only going to be using 3 paints: blue, white, and black. And yes, it's going to be very cold, very bitter, and I know that a lot of people, when they paint winter scenes, they like to make it feel warm and magical, but this scene doesn't really need that, because sometimes the bitterness, the coldness is just so starkly contrasting, and it's beautiful in its own way. Now, the Dalai Lama, in his book, The Art of Happiness, says, "It's the very struggle of life that makes us who we are, and it is our enemies that test us and provide us with the resistance necessary for growth." And that's true beyond humans. I mean, think of trees and animals as they're surviving the winter and having to escape prey. It makes them strong, it makes them keen. And yes, winter is definitely a very rough time for all of life. It's a season of toughness, but that gives you resilience and strength. And so I truly encourage you to struggle, because truthfully, when you struggle, much like winter, you're right before the spring and the dawn of a new season. And speaking of seasons, every season is the season of change. And we often associate that mantra with autumn or fall, when the leaves, are falling off the trees. But there is something to be learned from every season. I mean, yeah, winter kind of gives us these ethereal feelings of cold and scarcity and dormancy and quietness and kind of probably at a primal level a fear of survival, right? And it can be very isolating and very lonely. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. I mean, if you think about the scarcity and the fear of survival, it kind of triggers this feeling of needing to be prepared for it, like our ancient ancestors would have had to do so, right? And if you've ever lived in a cold climate, one thing that is always said to you is there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing. And there's a lot of truth to that humans have been able to adapt and survive. And that's a big part of struggle as well, is the only way that you adapt is when you have a reason to do so. And so don't be afraid of struggling in life. Don't be afraid of it. Just realize it's all temporary. It can and it will get better. But only if you are willing to adapt, right? You have to take steps to change, to get better, to improve your situation. And as long as you are doing that, the struggling will soon be behind you. Struggling helps you grow if you don't let it hinder your mindset. In essence, struggling is the ultimate test of strength and determination. Okay, let's kind of shift gears here a little bit and let's move on to talking about winter. Winter is often associated with the darkest days because there are less hours of sunlight. But if you think about it, since winter begins on the winter solstice, which in the northern hemisphere where I live is December 21st, winter is actually marked by the returning of the sun. Each day after the darkest day of the year will continuously be lighter for a little bit longer. And that's a beautifully optimistic way to look at something like this in life. That, yeah, we associate winter with things like struggle and hardship, but it's actually the beginning of something so much better. A way to tie this back to your life is that at some point you will experience your darkest day. And honestly, there's no telling when it will be. Unlike the seasons, it's definitely unpredictable as to when your darkest day will be. Winter as a season of your life could begin or end at any time. and it's not nearly as gradual as it would be in the real world. But if you think about the fact that the day after your darkest day, your truly darkest day, things should get a little bit lighter and brighter for many days to come. And that's kind of a comforting feeling. And the reason I really like comparing your darkest day to something like a season is that seasons return, and you will likely have multiple dark days through the cycle of your life. But it's important to remember that the warm glow of the sun will return. Another super important point I want to drive home. Society prospers when we help those that can't help themselves. Every single day, somebody out there is experiencing their darkest day. It's imperative for society to succeed that we help where we can, even if it's just, reaching out, seeing if people are okay. Sometimes even just being an ear, somebody that can be talked to or talked through with a problem. You don't always need to offer advice. Sometimes it just feels good to be heard on your darkest day. It reminds me of the old Greek proverb, right? A society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they will never sit in. And it's this lasting impression. It's this thing that you can do to subtly move people forward and to help them heal. Because much like a wound, like say you get a cut on your arm, right? If you take care of it in the beginning, there's a good chance that it won't scar as bad. And so it's important when we have these emotional wounds that we tend to them, that we heal them. But most importantly, the only way that you can really heal those wounds is if you have some sort of support system. And whether it's your brother, your sister, your cousin, your uncle, your aunt, your mother, your friend, it could be your neighbor. Why do we not tap into our neighbors and just ask to talk and connect with them? These are people that you live closer to than likely your own parents, and yet I know a lot of people that never really even get to know their neighbors, and it's sad. And yeah, you might be very different from them, but who knows? You just might meet someone you really like. And one thing about it, you can never have too many friends, right? So I encourage you, share your story, talk with people, but be willing to hear theirs too. And I guess a big thing to take away from this Greek proverb, that a society grows when old men plant trees whose shade they know they will never sit in, is that our individual actions, while they may seem small and they may seem so minuscule in the grand scheme of things, and they may feel like they're a very trivial impact, but in all reality, if we all just kind of planted a tree or two, collectively we could create a forest. And those little things that we do, as long as we're all kind of doing them for the betterment of society, can have a huge, huge impact. But all big change starts as something small. It's all about getting this ball rolling. And speaking of planting of trees, that's what I'm painting right there. This painting is based off a real place. And I was in the middle of a commute going to work in another town. And it had just snowed, so I was driving slow. I was being careful, being very hyper vigilant of the road and my surroundings. And I look off to the right because it was off the passenger side of the highway. And I see this wonderful winter landscape, and I stopped. Not a halting immediate stop, but I pulled off to the side of the road, turned around, went right back, and I just took it in. It was truly breathtaking. It was so cold that day, but the snow was just so fresh and bright. It was incredible. And it kind of made me think of that saying about smelling the roses in life. But I think the issue that I take with that expression is that it kind of gives these connotations for pleasant experiences of like a warm summer spring day on a lovely little sidewalk in a quaint, quiet part of town. And in this instance, I think we should remind ourselves to freeze for a moment Your eyes and your heart will be filled with the warmth of beauty. Not every beautiful experience is going to be in a quaint, quiet part of town where you're smelling the roses on the side of the sidewalk, or frolicking in a wildland meadow with all these little flowers and dots and dashes of color. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life are something that you kind of have to suffer to go see. And Aristotle, who is a much more elegant writer than myself, and likely a better speaker than myself, said it simply: to appreciate the beauty of a snowflake, it is necessary to stand out in the cold. And it's true that if you're always seeking comfort, you may miss out on so much of life that you will likely sense that something is missing. It kind of makes me think of this time that my wife and we went on a spontaneous road trip, almost 300 miles away from home. And we had our sights set on a lake. And we wanted to go experience this lake because it was so tranquil and beautiful, and we had just barely started dating. So, we were trying to be creative with our date ideas. And so we drive and hours, right? And we get there, and it's so freaking windy that this lake can't even be enjoyed. And I'm sitting there on the beach, drink in hand, sand being whipped into my face. My clothes are trying to rip themselves off, and I'm staring out into the water, just kind of contemplating, like thinking about my life. And kind of symbolically, we were talking about where we wanted the winds of our life to push our sails. And we were both still a little bit lost at that point in our lives. We didn't know exactly where we were going or what we were doing, but we just knew we were going to do it together. And it ended up kind of being this beautiful thing where we, for the first time in our relationship, had a really deep conversation. And the whole while we're talking about life, we're kind of talking at the top of our lungs, like shouting, almost cathartically, because the wind was just so loud. And maybe an hour or so had passed by of this, and suddenly we see this storm rolling in on the horizon, and it's magnificent. I mean, you could just sense the power of this storm. And as we're watching it come closer and closer, our conversation just kind of faded as we were so entranced just by the beauty of nature. And a day that had kind of seemed like it was a lost cause had actually ended up kind of turning into something. And before we knew it, the rain was upon us. And it was coming down so thunderously that we're running off the beach and trying to get back to the car and just soaking wet, right? And right after that, we just decided, it's time to go home, right? And so we're driving through this storm. And really, that's all there is to this story. And it's mostly just about not letting bad weather be a reason to not enjoy life. I mean, it's so easy to look outside and say, oh no, there's storm clouds. I'm gonna be sad today. And it's easier said than done, but sometimes just put on a jacket, put on a coat, whatever you need, good clothing, go out there and just find the beauty out there. It is out there. It is always out there. There's always a beautiful scene to be seen. And speaking of scenes, this scene that I'm painting, when I experienced it in real life, I experienced it alone. I didn't have anybody to share it with. And yeah, I took some photographs so that I could show people, but when they saw these photographs, they went, oh yeah, that's very nice, very lovely. But they didn't really get to experience the ambiance and the feeling of how soft snow is on the eyes, or the creek running, and just that comforting feeling of seeing life in a frozen world. And all of this life comes from the water that's supplied via the snow. And it's kind of crazy and almost just hard to even grasp the concept that all of this snow in this scene and in real life, it always starts with just one little snowflake sticking, and then another one and another one. And eventually you're left with this blanket of snow. And to tie it back to an idea that I had brought up earlier, if we were to each plant a tree, collectively we would plant a forest. Well, at an even smaller scale, if you think about snowflakes as an action, if we're all taking actions together, eventually we create this great change. And the really cool thing about comparing change to something like snow is that today snow is just frozen. It doesn't really do a lot today. It is in the landscape, but it's not really providing anything. But eventually it will melt and it will provide life with what it needs to survive, which is water. And so while your actions may seem small, even just the way you say hello to somebody, it can shape their whole day. And the kindness that you speak and that you spread, it doesn't go unnoticed, even if it feels so small. Another reason that I like using snow as a metaphor for change, at least I hope it's a metaphor. I'm not an English major, so if somebody knows what this is, please tell me. I love to learn new things like this. But the reason I like comparing it as a metaphor is because snow is not something that's instantaneous in its change. It takes time. It takes patience. I mean, you're waiting for the world to literally change. It needs to get warmer in order for this change to have impact. And I think in this world that we live in today, where technology is so prevalent, we've gotten so used to instant gratification that we kind of forget that some things just take a little bit of time. And time is fascinating. We think of time as this black and white thing where there's minutes and hours and days and weeks, but no 2 hours are the same. Have you ever done something that you really enjoy and it feels like the night just flies by as you're doing it? And conversely, if you are doing something you don't enjoy, those minutes can feel like hours, right? So time is kind of something that dilates in our life, and that can even be explained a little bit by Einstein's theory of relativity, in that it's all dependent on the observer, right? And right now, you are the observer. So I'm curious, what do you think? Is this helping you think through things? Is it helping you change your perspective? Because ultimately that's my goal. It's to share ideas. Has this been the longest 17 minutes of your life, or have you enjoyed the things that I have shared? I think that every great change that we have had in our society has started with the sharing of ideas. I mean, even all the way back to our early ancestors and them sharing ideas to survive winter. I mean, they were probably scared to death of this thing because it truly could mean the difference between life or death depending on how prepared for it you were. And really, in those days, they were just doing their best to survive an unforgiving landscape. And I'd ask you the question, what's changed? That's what we're doing today. It's just instead of battling the winter and the cold, our survival is all about working together to create a sustainable way of living and to be able to stop random acts of terrorism and, working together to create a beautiful and safe world. And the really crazy part about all of it is that's not an easy battle. And the real reason it's not an easy battle is because progress is not equivalent in every step that you take. So if I compare it to, say, like a ladder. So when you are on the ground level and you take the first step on the ladder and you move up 1 foot, we're going to keep the measurements easy to keep this simple. When you move up 1 foot, that's a huge improvement to where you were before. Now, if you move up to the second step, that's still a 100% improvement from where you were at the first step. But on the third step, it's only a 33% increase, even though it took you an equal amount of effort to get there. On the fourth step, you're at 25% of an increase. Even though you're still moving a foot every time, the change, as far as a percentage of change, is diminishing. And so as we're advancing in society, the amount of change that we're implementing isn't necessarily always going to be groundbreaking and moving at the speed of light. And this is another thing that I think our technology world has kind of shaped us in that we expect really quick results. But change requires patience. We have to wait for our proverbial snow to melt, to turn into water, to give life to our ideas. Patience is a virtue, and that's something you will always hear. It's so hard to be patient because we know how we want things to change. We know we want the snow to become water. But if the snow just instantly became water every time it snowed, it would just roll down the creek and it wouldn't provide the water that those trees need when spring comes. So it's super important to have good timing, and the timing of things just always seems to kind of work out the way that it needs to. I've always believed in this idea of cosmic timing, and cosmic timing is this concept that some people call divine intervention, but it's this idea that things were kind of just guided in a certain direction. And it's not to say there's not randomness or, things that can happen that can change the course of history, but cosmic timing in the sense of think about the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. And with the dinosaurs being wiped out, it paved the way for other types of life to flourish. And humans, we kind of have this funny view of the world because we think that we've conquered nature. And truly, nature is much more powerful than we give her credit for. Who knows? We might go the same way of the dinosaurs. We might have our cataclysmic event that wipes us out. I mean, there's nothing to say we won't. But it's nothing to really live in fear of, right? I mean, just like our ancestors before us who may have been scared of the winter because it could have been their mass extinction event. If you spend your whole life worrying about the proverbial winter, you won't get to enjoy the serenity that it is. So I'm gonna say this, and I know that there's some controversy around this term, but be a snowflake. I know people have given that word this meaning, this negative connotation in life, that it means that you're soft. But a snowflake is something that gives life. It's this small little piece of a much bigger tapestry, this much bigger blanket of snow. And so when you are a force of life that can give life, you will benefit the environment around you. And don't be afraid of things that you can't change, like the speed of how fast change actually comes about. It's better just to enjoy life. It's better to just freeze for a minute, because your heart will be filled with the warmth of all the beauty that is out there. All right, everybody, that's it for this episode of Journey of an Artist. Thank you for tuning in. Please consider leaving a like, a comment, or subscribe.